to the final cultural conversations for this year. This has been a 4-part series that we've run between the ANU and AMaGA. We started in May, I think, and have done 4 sessions. And so some of you might have come to a couple of them, and this might be the first one for some of you, but thanks for coming along. We know it's an early start, but we found this was a good time when everyone was available, all of those of us who were willing to get up early. And it's created a really great opportunity for kind of making connections between, I think initially we were thinking of it as like across the lake, the people at ANU and people in the cultural heritage sector in the national institutions, that there's been very few opportunities for us to come together over the past few years for obvious reasons. And so the idea of this series was to kind of kickstart some of that stuff and to get us talking to each other again. So I'd like to start by saying I'm Katrina from the Centre for Digital Humanities Research. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to thank my co-organisers, Kylie Message from the Humanities Research Centre, who can't be here this morning but has really driven this series through the year, and also Rowan Henderson, who is here but sourcing food, sustenance of some kind for us, and Craig Middleton, who's another one of our organisers from AMaGA. So the structure of this morning, it's much the same as the other sessions we've run. If you've been to those, is we'll have a series of short 5-minute talks by our wonderful panel. And then afterwards, we'll have questions and discussion, and we hope you'll feel invited to get involved. We're a sort of smallish group, so hopefully we can have a great discussion. The topic this morning is digital and GLAM, which is a topic that's close to my heart as someone who works in digital humanities. And I'm put myself on the panel so that I can explain a little bit why that is. So what I'll do is I'll really briefly introduce the panel. I'll just essentially tell you who they are. Some of you will know them, and some of you will be meeting new people. So I imagine they'll give you a bit of context as to why they're here on this panel in their 5-minute talks. And then Craig has put himself on, well, I've put him on the panel actually. And he will wrap up at the end with his 5 minutes, and then we'll go over the questions. And so, of course, people sat down, not in the order that I wrote them down, but that's fine.
Sorry.
Fine. So we've got Dr. Seccombe, who is a colleague of mine from the ANU in the School of Art and Design, Dr. Keir Winesmith, who is from the NGA and is head of digital, Alison Dellit, who is the Assistant Director General of the Collaboration Branch at the National Library of Australia and running Trove, which is the reason we've invited her along today, and Craig Middleton, who's a Senior Curator at the National Museum of Australia. So to get started, I'll now sit down and take on my role as part of the panel. I've been keen to do this topic of digital and GLAM as part of the series, and Craig as well. It's something we've had conversations about. And I guess to get started, to sort of explain why this is something that I work on, I have a background as an art historian, not in digital art history, not in digital art, in very traditional art history, but without giving you a very long origin story of how I came to be here, I sort of moved into working much more with digital methodologies after I finished my PhD research, and ended up here at the ANU in the Centre for Digital Humanities Research about 5 years ago. And digital humanities is not necessarily connected with the GLAM sector. There's a lot of it that looks at areas like web science and social sciences. But because of my background and the background of the centre, we're really keen to get involved with the national institutions and bring them into the teaching that we were doing and the research that we were doing, and also to give our students opportunities to see what these skills they were developing on using digital methodologies, which might be things like mapping or virtual reality or working with kind of large image data sets, kind of what that might look like in practice. Oh gosh, we've got to. And And so I guess that I'll talk about kind of two main things that I've been doing, what I'm doing at the moment or have been doing. And one of them is that, I think I mentioned this at one of the cultural conversations earlier in the year, is I've been running a course with the National Museum of Australia, with Craig, who's collaborated on that course, where we ask the students to build digital projects. And the idea is to get them to do some blue sky creative thinking about how you might engage audiences using digital tools. So that could be via the web, by creating websites or things that are based on websites. But it can also be through tools or things created that people might use in the gallery space. So everything from stuff that seems pretty mainstream now, like podcasting, through to things like app development and the use of augmented reality. And I don't tell the students what they should create. In fact, I refuse to tell them what they should create. And they come up with some really weird ideas that a lot of them have no background in the museum sector, maybe one or two each course, and the rest of them come from everything from engineering and computer science to sort of, general history or law. And so a lot of them don't come with any preconceived ideas about what should be done in the sector, so they come up with some really unusual approaches around producing things like, someone produced a game based on the Snowy hydroelectric scheme, and he's an engineering and computer science student, but he took himself off to the National Archives and researched in the hard copy archives to give the game historical depth. And so that's the sort of the teaching side of things, but I'm also, through that, have become really interested in how people are acquiring the skills that are needed in these sectors where we're not necessarily, traditionally, at least in the way that I was educated, there was very little training in these kind of digital methodologies. And you tended to have to acquire the skills yourself, or you collaborated with people who had the skills. And so I've been working on a project with Sean Minnie, who did our master's program, to try and understand some of those informal ways that people are acquiring skills and applying them in their work. So that's sort of fun. I could talk about a million other things, but I will skip that.
No, well, that actually, following on from what you're doing, it's kind of interesting because my approach to art too has been along those lines of questioning technology right from when I was a student at Sydney College of the Arts in the 1980s. What is this computer? Apart from the fact it was really good for typing out essays, that I really wanted to know what could it do for me for art. And what I've discovered now is teaching, I've been teaching this course, Art in the Digital Age, at the School of Art and Design. And what I realise is that all of the students that I teach, none of them program, very few of them, unless they come from one of the courses. They don't edit online. They're users of the interface, and they're big social media consumers, and they've never really thought about the tiers of technology or what that means. And so to teach them conceptual art ideas of art in the digital age is this added complexity that they haven't thought about, because some of those ideas they haven't yet been exposed to, like, how to make art considering the Anthropocene or post-humanism or techno-bodies, or the idea of ethics in, cyberspace and all of those kinds of things. And then for them to also think, well, artists are actually using and have transformed digital technology. They come across that Jim Pike, which they've never thought about before, and discover that he coined, the electronic superhighway, and that there were artists thinking about these things in post-war Australia as well. So I try to teach a lot of Australian content too, because there are a lot of really amazing artists in Australia, and Katrina teaches into it too, looking at Web 2.0 and how artists really thought about subverting the web. And so I'm teaching this generation who kind of go, my app doesn't work. Like, how do I? And then they start to think, oh wow, I can subvert it. And these are the kind of students that we're sending out into the world to get jobs in the GLAM sector, who haven't thought or how do we get them to think, I can actually change this technology to work, rather than this program is not working, or I don't understand this program, and thinking outside of the square, and how do we get things to be more interesting. And also, thinking about the digital interfaces as well. And, so in my practice, I've had a lot to do with interdisciplinary thinking about digitising and understanding our relationship with digital objects and digital virtual objects. So I've been working with scientists on how to digitise living organisms like plants and insects, and what does that mean to have that relationship with digital objects and even our own bodies as organisms too. So I was thinking actually this morning about coming here and doing this. I remember this has been digitising in the GLAM sector has been such a question for such a long time. And I remember running a big seminar on Hass on the Hill at Parliament House in 2012, I think it was, with Dr. John LaSalle, who unfortunately passed away, and he was the director of the Atlas of Living Things. And we had all of these humanities people talking about Trove and all of these really difficult things of digitising collections at the NGA or digitising that. And John LaSalle came up and said, I have to digitise over 2 million insects before they become extinct. How do I do that? So his problem was even larger than the Hass sector. And so, it's across the board, like, what does it mean to have a digitised collection? What does it mean to interact with it? What does it mean to get our young people to engage with the sort of collections that we have? But then also think about, well, how does that lead us to understand the real collections that we have too? Like, we're creating these virtual kind of digital worlds where how do we protect the actual documents that we've got? And so as artists, I'm really interested in the way that, in the same way that you're saying that we think about big data, how do we visualise it, how do we understand it, how do we interact with it, and also how do we get funding for that kind of, how do we get governments to realise that it's critically important?
Guess we're going in with that, Katrina.
Yeah, I mean, you can meet for me.
There's two want to go last. And this is for that. Go. Hi everyone, my name's Keir, and I grew up on Gadigal Wongal land, and now live and work in Marble land, and haven't quite worked out what it's like to be here yet. I'm still kind of like processing this place. And we're in front of Pinanjara land, APY land. It's sort of, so we're on country and kind of in front of country in a way. And I, at my work at the National Gallery, what I try as best I can to frame it in the context of the place we're in and the continent that we serve. One thing I don't know if I've mentioned to you, Katrina, it only came out yesterday. I'm about to leave the National Gallery in a couple of weeks, 5 weeks, spooked by that, and to join the NFSA as a newly created Chief Digital Officer. So I'm going to start thinking about digital in a different way.
Wow.
Be even closer. Be even closer.
Yeah, it's like,
See a lot more of
you. And I've been thinking about this problem, opportunity, price opportunity of digital in the GLAM sector for 15, almost 20 years now. And I'm going to a wedding in a few weeks. And the wedding is Geoffrey Shaw and Sarah Kenderdine. And Geoffrey Shaw, who was a media artist working in the first wave of VR in the art museum, so he worked in the first wave of VR, which is in the 90s. There was a second wave in the mid-2000s. I did some projects related to that, and there's been a third wave. I've also been working in San Francisco when that wave broke and met, founders of Oculus and stuff like that. And they were like, oh, this belongs in the museum. And it's interesting thinking about how we're constantly believing we're creating the new using technology, and for the most part we're not. We're doing a poor proxy of things that have already come. And as someone who's middle-aged now, I can even be part of some of those waves and be kind of influenced by them, I hope. And I think part of our job as committed kind of GLAM workers and educators and technologists is actually understanding the cultural context and the historical context of frame all our lived experience that isn't necessarily framing it for our students or our colleagues or our visitors in different ways, and trying to make things that act as sort of portals into those worlds but project into the future. So in doing portals of those worlds that project into the future, I was just thinking over the last couple of days before coming in, what are the things I've said over 20 years of working at the intersection of digital and culture that have landed? People still come back to me with some frequency and say, we didn't do that VR project because you told us not to. So I gave a talk in 2017 and it was on a stage that was absolutely massive, like enormous, like the screen itself was like as wide as this and 3 times as high. And I didn't realize that when I made my slides, that it would be like iconically big. And I read this slide that just said, don't do VR. So I was doing VR projects at the time. But what I was trying to say is don't do VR for the sake of it. And that was on the next slide. The only one that people remember is don't do VR. So I'm that guy. And then a little bit later, I gave a keynote at Alice Springs at an AMaGA conference. And I said, don't do apps. Like, apps are dying, they're going, invest in the web. Everything is going to be on the web. It was in the future, it is in the past. Apps were a dead end for museums, it's wasted money. And then 3 or 4 years later, I was at a meeting at the Australian Museum, and someone came up to me and said, we were able to convince, I won't tell you the executive who they convinced, we were able to convince X not to do an app because of what you said, and they were in the audience. And I was like, and they're like, oh, it saved us $1 million.
Yeah.
And so, like, don't do VR, don't do apps. And then I gave a keynote in Spain earlier in the year, and I knew the stage was going to be big this time, and I wrote this massive thing, as big as you can make it, to the corners, which said, don't do NFTs. And that got tweeted, and showed up. And this was before NFTs crashed and burned and went nuts. And so, if I could be remembered for anything, it's as a professional technologist working in the GLAM sector for the last 15 or so years, who's really only claim to fame is telling me not to do technology, and give you pretty good reasons why. So that's my legacy. That's a legacy I'm very comfortable with.
Yeah.
And then I'll probably need to ameliorate that a little bit at the end of the session. I'll see if I go there. The last thing of this period of time where I know it's worked because people keep coming back to me is I worked with Dr. Suze Anderson, who's from Newcastle, an Australian academic now living and working in Washington, in the US. And we wrote a book called The Digital Future of Museums. And in it, in the first little bit, was a definition of what we meant by digital. And that is the most quoted thing and the most cited thing in the entire book, because actually we've been, for the most part, operating without a definition of digital. And that's an interesting thing to leave as a legacy, is a porous, amorphous, blended-edged version of what we mean by that word that is a proxy for almost all of our work. So, thanks. Oh, and my alarm's went off 5 minutes, yes.
Hi, I'm Alison, and yes, to give you some idea of what I'm like, I'm caffeinated. My notes start with my own name, just in case, and certainly my job title, which is the Assistant Director General of Collaboration. But in practice at the library, I look after Trove and all of its associated systems, as well as the library's digitisation program for content within the library's own collections. Trove, and in preparing for this, I'm just thinking about where we all took it. Trove, before it was Trove, was my first role at the National Library. I started in 2006 as a graduate, and I was picked up in the first couple of months and asked if I wanted to go and work on something that was an attempt to provide all of our digital content in a single place. I now understand the public service well enough to know that what had happened was that they had bid for staff and failed, and there was a graduate who arrived in the building at the time who had nothing to do, and I was free staff. But it was such an exhilarating experience to be given this problem to solve and to think through the very basics of how to solve it. And then my career took me off to collection management, where I worked on my many other things that I'm notorious for was making the decision that the National Library wasn't going to allocate dewey numbers to collection material anymore. And if I go into a public library, that's often the main thing people want to talk to me about is my relationship with Dewey. But also there, I worked on and built what turned into the National E-Deposit Service, which was the process by which the National Library got legislation to collect digital content alongside the print content that we collect one copy of, and then an attempt to turn that into a national system working across jurisdictions with all of the state libraries to deposit content. So at that point I sort of accepted that the digital was where I kept drifting back to, and it is innately my home and where I feel most confident and capable in how we look. And what I did want to do with probably my 4 minutes that's left was just to reflect a little bit on some of the things that I think have really changed in that environment in the last 15 years, on the basis of working very much in library digital spaces and what we've produced. And part of that is because I do feel sometimes when we work with the digital humanities that the paradigm is still very much as it was 15 years ago, and there are some really big things that are structurally changing in the environment that are making life much more difficult, as well as opening up a lot more opportunities, and we have balanced it with a little bit of optimism. Although without the coffee that might be harder, so just grain it up a little bit. One of those that, and I, particularly when I realised that Keir is about to move into a CDO role, I got a certain extra amount of pleasure out of some of this. I will say, because I think when you're working at the kind of scale that the NFSA is working at, a lot of these problems get very pointy, and certainly they are at the library. And I guess the other piece to say in that is that when I speak on behalf of Trove, now Trove is old tech, my world is old tech. Trove has been around for a long time, and it was built on technology which is becoming, which is in many cases unsustainable. And doing innovation in that environment is extraordinarily difficult. But the first big thing that's changed, and this is why I think students coming through behave differently, is the advent of 15 years ago, the internet was still a place that you could find and create, well, not digital, but still a place where you could build small innovations and expand them to scale. That's almost impossible now, because while that environment is not as regulated as it might have been, it is very corporatised. So you are working in an environment where large multinationals own and dominate all of the spaces that you're working in. And that's true if you're talking about hardware servers, and it's true if you're talking about the cloud. It's very difficult to actually find the space that you need that is outside of an environment that is highly controlled in a very corporate environment. And it's very difficult to do it ethically because sustainability is becoming a real issue, and I did want to talk about that too, that a lot of the technologies that we want to lever to make things are very difficult to sustain environmentally. I will say for GLAM, I think that's mediated by a look at the future, which is that my suspicion is that our current boom time of travel will end, and in 10 years we will see less people able to have in-person experiences at national institutions or key places, and digital provides an alternative for us to be national institutions. But there is an issue in that space. And that combines with what is becoming a really scary rise of cyber security threat. Because in an environment with such instability, and I think we need to realise when companies like, it's very easy to be critical of companies like Optus, etc., and it's fun. But in an environment where companies with that level of inside input can't control and manage and protect their data, that raises real issues for GLAM organisations in their capacity to protect data that we collect. And in many ways, I think what it's pushing GLAM institutions into is thinking about why we hold the data that we hold and whether it's safe and secure to hold that data. That's a more likely future for us than keeping up in a cyber security base in which we are rapidly outclassed. Yeah, I did say I was going to be a bit depressed. I will flip that bit, but there's positives in those two things. One, the tools available in the toolkit now for people interested in doing digital are phenomenal. That rise of big services, APIs, cloud environments has also brought with it machine learning APIs that let you do fabulous things in TikTok. And we have a generation that are used to being able to create their own virtual worlds from their imaginations. And that part of the environment is really inspirational. And it means that we need to think less, I think, about what you can code at home when you're thinking about this, and you need to think more about how you creatively use the environment that's around you and how we build things that can plug in and manage within that context. Similarly, the flip side of privacy concerns, which is where I'm going to go next, we're certainly starting to see a great deal of people live their lives online, and for them, the implications of having those activities and lives available and trackable and released are much more significant than they were before. The National Library has an archive of websites, so we go back to 1995. One of the things I love to remind myself of is 1995, 1996, anyone studying computer science had to set up their own little website on the university's web pages, and it was an exercise in coding, so they were graded on it. Now, those people who set up those websites, I can guarantee you, looking at them, never thought their mothers were going to look at them. Like the content that people put up on the public web at that point in time about their love lives, about their relationships, about the way they saw the world was so naive and innocent to our eyes that it's one of the pieces that worries me the most in the archive. But people don't do that anymore. That sense of freedom, that the internet is a place where you may not be identified, has closed so dramatically, even for those anonymous accounts. But again, there's a flip side to that. And that is that identity and community and connection has become something so prevalent online. And that means that for a GLAM organisation, I think, the digital offers us a chance to improve equity and to improve the diversity of who we reach and to improve who we can talk to. One of the many things that sustains me with Trove is understanding that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples use Trove outside the proportion of the population with higher usage, and a lot of that usage is coming from remote communities that who never had access to a cultural institution, and also who can culturally create their own comfort worlds online. So digital provides opportunities for us to diversify in a way that I think would represent our country much more accurately. At the same time as we've got privacy, we also have community and connection and a very strong sense of valid identity through the digital. And all of that provides opportunities. Finally, I guess, the other thing that I think we have to look at is the cost of maintaining digital, which comes from all of those things, is escalating. And I feel like it's impossible to explain how bad this has gotten in the last 18 months. But a lot of the time, for a Java developer, we are now paying twice as much as we were. We've gone beyond what you would consider to be good pay rise material, and those skill sets are in such a premium. And some of that is because everybody is flocking into digital post the pandemic. We live in a public service town, it's much worse in Canberra to manage. But part of that, I think, is how we create digital careers that provide meaning for people when we move outside of a coder as the idea of someone who comes in and provides a simple service. Because if we don't figure out a way to create meaning and to connect it up for equity within our own organisations between cultural workers and people writing code will continue to grow, and we won't see a future. So if we're thinking about how to connect the humanities, I think we have to think about holistic career paths and skill sets in that context as well, and thinking about how to work within all of those frameworks. And I've probably gone over time already, even though I feel like I just raised more things than I answered, but there's always questions. There you go, Craig, sum that up.
I don't know if I can sum all that up, that's a lot, but it's really interesting. I think, so I'm Craig Middleton, I'm a Senior Curator at the National Museum of Australia. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal or Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting and sharing on today. I suppose I might give my 2 cents first, and I'm a curator, so I'm much less of a technical specialist. In fact, I'm not a technical specialist at all in the realm of the digital, and what I'm more interested in is the cultural significance of digital materials. So hopefully what I could have gone a few different ways today, but I think based on what's been said, I think I'm going to offer something else as well into what is already a very big conversation. So really, I suppose the area that I'm going to look at is collections. So collections are and prevail to be a core aspect of museum work. Many would say that collections are what define museums. They are what differentiate museums from other kinds of institutions. They are our bread and butter, and I don't disagree with this wholly. But what strikes me as a key issue that the sector is facing at the moment is our understanding of digital objects and their place in museum collections. And I'm sure a lot of you will agree. Of course, we have digitisation. The process of digitally documenting, reproducing physical objects in our collection, that's probably one most people are familiar with in terms of their practice and the importance of that as a practice. Then we have these things called born digital objects or things that have only ever existed in the digital space. And recently I've been reading about reborn digital objects, which are these objects that when collected by a museum and preserved, they're reformatted or emulated or held in a different context, which then means they're reborn again in a different kind of way. So they're not as authentic as they were being created or produced in the digital space, and they're something else again, and then their use is different and their reuse is different. Very interesting. I haven't quite grappled with that yet, but I still think it's very interesting. But beyond defining how we understand digital objects from almost a very material perspective, I'm increasingly concerned that we're not paying enough attention to the cultural significance of this material. And more specifically, I guess I'm going to take a look at social media, because I think it's the easiest one to sort of interface with as a first step. And as we know, and as has already been said, many people understand their digital expression as inherently tied to their identity, inherently part of their identity. I'm a millennial, and so while I had some part of my childhood without social media and digital, most of my childhood was that, so I do understand. I was in chat rooms, I made friends through MSN Messenger. I came out on MSN Messenger actually to a few friends on there. And so that part of my identity is, not that part, but my identity is entwined with those spaces. And they have informed how I operate as well. And we only, beyond what I just said about my experience, we only have to take a cursory look at platforms like TikTok to really understand how people engage in this space and what it means to their identity. And so, in the case of museums then, it's really simple to say we must engage with social media and collect social media, but I think I'm interested in ensuring that we look at social media with the same logics that we might look at physical collecting. Collecting social media is a lot harder than just saying, we should collect social media. And because of the third-party platform issue. But I want to give an example of how we can maybe move through understanding digital expression as a worthy form of cultural significance. And I want to talk about the TikToker Valorish, which some of you may have read about earlier this year. Valorish is a Ukrainian girl who shared videos of her and her family in a bomb shelter in Ukraine during the war earlier this year. I know the war's still happening. Her TikTok has changed a bit. And she was also documenting the shelled out city of Chernihiv, and I probably said that wrong. Amazing, if you have an opportunity, go have a look, because this young woman is doing amazing things at documenting her environment, documenting her experience. But we can actually liken this to Anne Frank, a Jewish girl who kept a diary in which she documented life hiding under Nazi persecution. And so both women are using the tools of their day to diarise their experience. But I think in many ways some would put more cultural value or significance on the diaries, the handwritten diaries, than they may a TikTok video. Now, like I was saying before, even if we all agree that social media has the same potential socially and culturally, the challenge, of course, is the platform, a third party. And so these are just questions now, because I absolutely have no answers for them. What is the role of platforms in this space? How can we collect social media without the support of or collaboration with these platforms? And is the digital environment, the visual digital environment, culturally significant to the social media? And if that's the case, what have we lost with the many and numerous branding updates to these platforms and sort of systems updates to these platforms? These are questions I think about a lot, and I don't have answers to them. But because there's a different kind of challenge that I face as a curator at the National Museum in just trying to, argue for digital material to be collected full stop. I'm going to stop there because I don't think I really need to offer that much more. I think there's another conversation that's, I think, more prevalent that's emerged from this, and it's really about skills and skills gaps in the sector moving forward. And I wonder if I can ask the question to the panel about, just to respond to that in a little more detail in terms of what kinds of skills or how institutions, GLAM institutions, should be thinking about recruitment moving forward and sort of upskilling staff, or is it another approach that we have to take to be able to do the work that we're all talking about? Yeah.
Never got skills investment. I'm also going to steal that sentence. I don't think I need to offer any more. I think that's just great. It's going to be like, I didn't do. Sorry. So the thing I get, like I mentioned before, I give a bunch of talks. The thing I get asked the most at the end of talks is, what did you study to end up where you are, from young people? And I never had a good answer. Like, I studied computer science and physics for ages, and then I met artists who were using computers to do weird things, more weird and interesting than anything that was happening in the first .com boom. So I left that world and just worked for artists, making weird stuff for them, and then moved to Germany to make weird stuff for German artists, who are weirder than Australian artists, by the way, just if the opportunity arises, take it. And that sort of propelled me on a really different trajectory, and I've now got a PhD in media, which I did not expect and did not set out to do. And so when people ask me, like, oh, I want to study what you studied, like, there isn't actually a thing you can study. It makes no sense. It's sort of back to front. And I think our institutions, especially, I was going to the ANU, but I helped start a course at UNSW called Immersive Design, or Visualization and Immersive Design, which is a master's course where we are trying to create a kind of new generation of practitioners who are technically skilled and culturally minded. The premise was, if you leave Facebook to the people Mark Zuckerberg will hire, you'll end up with this dystopian present. And so we need to create people we need to help people become technically skilled and culturally minded so that they can make the future that we want to live in. And so, I teach for free into 3 different courses. Oh, I should say that loud in this I teach at a high expense into 3 different courses across the Eastern Seaboard, and it's all around digital and cultural leadership, or it's around sort of transforming either people who are culturally minded into ones who can operate and thrive in a sort of technologically mediated environment, or people who are like big fat nerds but don't understand the world they're in. And so we try and drag people into that messy middle, because it's in the messy middle that most of us in the room operate, certainly all the people on this side. And it's in that messy middle that the best future we have is. And so I'm all in the messy middle in terms of skilling. So the last thing I would say, just unskilling, because it comes back to internal as well, because all of my peers, for the most part, are already in their careers and already kind of set, in many cases, in their ways. I have a colleague at the National Gallery who has had the same job since before I had a job, which breaks my brain. And every time I talk about this thing I want to try, they're like, oh, 3 directors ago they tried that, good luck. And A, you're just motivating me, but also B, so what we talk about a lot internally is digital projects are one of 3 things. They're either telling new stories in new ways, they are building new platforms to communicate with our audiences, or they are transformative about how the staff works using digital modalities and means to collaborate and communicate. And all of the money and all of the energy that my department puts in is that project one of those 3, 2 of those 3, and if it's all 3 of those 3, if it's new stories told in new ways and changing the way we work internally, and all of those things are somewhere digital, then that's where we spend all of our time and all of our money. That's our number 1 priority. And that has been actually effective in changing people's perception of what's possible, much more so than me pontificating, actually going, well, we're going to resource things to do that, and we're not going to resource that. And so people are like, well, I'll gravitate to where the resources are and learn things along the way.
Right, I've got something to say on that point. I think it is really interesting in terms of how we understand what skill is, and I do also teach into some scientific classes, like the Unravelling Complexity, the Vice Chancellor's course, and so I often present to a bunch of very ambitious students from an artistic perspective, and they're always like, oh, we didn't know art could do that, you know. And but I also teach life drawing, which is also a very hands-on skill, and it's very immediate, and I sort of see what the university students are, and it's made me realise that we often think about what are we going to teach young people or anyone at university, it's not just young people, but I think we're missing the point that I think our school, our primary school and high school is now failing us. I think it's really old-fashioned. I actually think that matriculation and the HRC should be scrapped. I actually think it's failing students in the most profound ways. It's not preparing them for the future. It's unrealistic. You know, when does anyone look back and go, what did I get for my HSC? Nothing, no one is ever going to do that. It's a waste of time, and those kind of cultural things that need to be embedded in our culture have to be done from a very early age, and it's not being done. It's just, I don't know what the education system is supposed to be doing, but you look at all the students who are leaving school to become tradespeople and other things as well. They also need that cultural experience embedded into them, and you don't want them coming to a museum just because Ned Kelly's helmet is there and they've never been stepped inside a museum before. You know, so it's that, how do we fight that populist idea of the museum? And you know, I don't know if any of you saw that horrendous program that they just had with Tom Gleeson on the museum the other night. I mean, what the fuck was that? Like, that was the most depressing thing I've ever seen. And you think, God, surely the ABC, for starters, could be doing better than that. But that's what our children are seeing. Like, that was a build-up to going to see a shark display, and that's what money is being spent on. So I don't know whether or not you have anything to say about that.
Wow.
Just like set the ball up right there.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's another thing, I will come back to, thinking about someone who's trying to teach students who might work in the sector, might also work in a lot of different areas. But yeah, with the thing about museums, because I've got an interdisciplinary cohort, a lot of the time, a lot of them haven't been to the National Museum who we work with. So then they're just down the road from our building. It's a 15-minute walk. And so that's, for me, that's been really interesting. Like, it actually sometimes a little bit confronting, that I kind of think, and I know that I grew up in a family and with an interest in art, so I sought out those experiences. I know, I've got family members who never go to galleries, who never go to museums, so I've got sort of both sides, I'm aware of it, but they're still always at university, I'm always still a little bit surprised, and maybe it's, I don't know, during naivety that people haven't engaged, but I see that as one of the reasons that I collaborate with the GLAM sector is to take these students from law or from computer science or just from an arts degree who still haven't engaged with collections, to say it's like these are things, these are places you can work with. They're not just for curatorship students, they're not just for museum studies students, they're the ways that the broader public, that school children engage with a lot of ideas around culture and science. And so it's quite, it's quite important for us to take the ideas that we develop at university and find ways to engage publicly. And GLAM is really, even though I've just said a lot of people don't go, but we can keep sort of chipping away at that. Our master's program is digital humanities and public culture, so we're really interested in how you take the ideas and the debates that we have here at the university and reach outwards and also ask those people to join in, not just to say, oh, here's some fantastic ideas we've got that we will give you, but to ask people what they're thinking. But to go, and I think I might say this really quickly, and I think I might see there's people in the audience who I'm sure have questions or comments. But with skills, I think one thing I've learned through teaching, kind of through my teaching practice, and which I hadn't thought about a lot before I started actually teaching, is rather than just doing it myself, my own research, is that it's kind of, I've decided in a way it's kind of pointless to teach a really specific set of digital skills. And some people here who've been in my classes and they'll be like, this is true, she won't teach us, she won't give us a link through tutorials.
Right.
Because the one thing that's true, you know, and I think Keir touched on this, that's true about the digital is it just changes constantly. And if I teach a student over 2 years and say, here you go, you've learned this software, you've learned this, this is what you need to know about bias or ethics, done. It's out of date within 6 months maybe of people graduating. And so something that I try and teach students is how to acquire those skills themselves, of how to say, I want to be able to do that, I want part of that, and to have the confidence to embark on it, not to say, I can't do it, but to say, I'll try and figure out how to do it. And maybe it'll be hard, maybe you'll have to find someone who's better at it. But one of the most rewarding things is seeing people upskilling themselves in areas that I'm not always very good at. It's like there are methods that I'm great at, you know, I think I'm pretty good at. But a lot of the stuff my students do, I can't do what they can do. So I think that's trying to find ways for that to be. I was really struck by what Alison said about that, you know, inequity that's growing, and thinking about how to give more people the confidence about these skills. But I'm like, do you want to say that?
No, it's problem solving, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually going to go back because I've spent a lot of my life working on, or my career working on collecting social media with zero result, right? And I'm really over that conversation. I'm a bit pleased that TikTok is absolutely the biggest issue right now because that belongs to the NFSA, not the National Library. Just saying. It was when Craig was talking that one of the things really hit me. And I think the truth is we've never known what we want to collect with social media. In none of the conversations that I have been in have we known what it is that we're trying to collect. So the National Library takes snapshots of Twitter pages. We've been doing that for a long time. That is not a meaningful, not a meaningful way of collecting social media. And the skill that we need to start there, because, you know, the National Library does have people who can solve the technology issues. They probably think it's hard, but they're good and we'll get there. And actually, to be honest, even though I think your rights issues are things we can solve too, because I think that one of the things our sectors is really good at is working out when you're going to take a risk on rights and when you're going to push to say this is of value. But if we're going to do that around social media, we have to know that what we're producing is of value. And I actually think the skill is curatorial. I think the start skill is, and I will say it will have to come from communities that are embedded in TikTok, which is one way of saying I'm too old. But I think we do need to think about that. We need to fire imagination up around what it is that we are trying to achieve. What do you want to do with art? What do you want to do with our collections? And if we can get that piece right, then the rest of the skill sets flow from it. We can work those pieces out. But I think in a lot of the questions here is that we're not engaging with the culture of people coming through. And museums and libraries are about culture. They're about recording and utilising and weaponising. I'm in a mood. Managing culture. And there is such hunger around culture at the moment. That was in my notes. I think that there's a strong sense that culture is going to be part of how we survive the next 2 decades. But if we're not bringing young people's culture in, then it's not surprising we're not engaging them around Java coding or around those other pieces because they're not understanding what we're here for.
Is there comments or questions
That's an interesting idea.
from the audience? Yeah, I was just going to help you with that.
Do you want this? I think it's so hard to do it properly.
Thanks for what's been an absolutely brilliant panel. I've really enjoyed it, and I've been on many panels around the digital, but very rarely do you get such nuanced discussions of digital, which I've banned in my own cultural institutions I've worked in from being used as a noun rather than an adjective, which I think is part of the problem with the confusion. But, seeing, digital as tool, method, culture, politics, interface, infrastructure, contained in this panel, I really, really enjoyed it. And I think what we were ending with how do you reflect the culture of the audience within the institution is a really important question, because historically the digital has been about transmitting the cultural value of the institution outwards rather than a dialogic relationship. But my question was actually about politics, actually, because it seems to me, if you look at the history of digital transformation in the GLAM sector, and Keir pointed to this, it's like, now we have to have apps, now we have to have NFTs, and there is this kind of soft colonization of Silicon Valley rhetoric around democracy, participation, and engagement, especially the kind of politics of engagement. And now we see AI in the art museum as being naturalized as well. And to what extent do you think how important it is for the GLAM sector to defend digital public space and talk about literacy beyond just working with cool tools, but understanding, as Erica was saying, what lies behind the interface, and this is a cultural form as well as a tool, and it comes with it a load of epistemological and social questions.
Great, can I have a go?
Yeah.
Yes!
That's the thing that we institutionally should be good at more than anything else, and let me talk about, he said this himself, if you work in one of my teams, I say this all the time, so there's a little bit of a repeated theme, is we need to be great prioritizers. That should be as GLAM sector workers, that should be our superpower, is going from mission and values and then operationalizing those into priorities. That sounds sort of boring even as I say it out loud. And so the way I talk about it is experimentation leading to great infrastructure guided by good governance. And so that's the mantra that I use internally. And so what that means in kind of reality though is because we can do all of the things. And in the case of the National Gallery, we have all of the art. In the case of the National Museum, they have all of the things, right? And FSA, it's millions of things, and it could easily be billions without much effort, right? So because it can be all of the things, and because we have comically limited resources, and we are a victim of a very explicit fire as many people as you can over the last 10 years goal, we have teams of 6 that are now teams of 2 with the job of the team of 6. So the thing we actually need to be best at, and it should be grounding all of our work, is how do we make the priorities about where we put our limited resources and energies. And I think one of the things we don't do well is thoughtfully move from the thing that 6 people can do to the thing that 2 or 3 people can do through the lens of the mission and value. We often do the easiest thing, which with technology, some things are actually, because of the systems you've described, are actually really, really easy, crazy easy. Stuff that was you can spend 6 months working on something in the past, you can do it in an afternoon now, is nuts, right? And so you do the easy thing, or you do the thing that Silicon Valley is helping you do, or you do the thing that funders seduced by. Or there's money for an app if you want it, but actually you don't need an app. We need a better printer or whatever things. We need a camera that actually shoots at that resolution. No, we can't do that. We can have an app, we're not going to all this money.
Or a human being.
Or a human being. Quarter of my team are basically paid for out of capital because I've found a chink in their armour, and I can't say this. I've found a chink in their armour, and as long as it's codified a very specific way, I can basically capitalise 80% of my stuff. And so we just capital fundraising, and then we just funnel into people because actually it's people. It's always people. Technology is always people. It's always culture. So the thing that often you'll find yourself in a meeting, and actually meeting strategy is probably the most important thing you can learn about success in digital in the cultural sector, is you're in a meeting and a decision needs to be made, and you need like the right tools and strategies to make that call so it doesn't go down for more information and it doesn't go up for someone else to decide who isn't actually an expert, who isn't in the space. So the big shift that we've made at the gallery, and it's something I've learned working in California, is establishing a set of principles for digital projects with a broad set of stakeholders, holding them tight and using them to make all of your prioritizations that point on. So you don't need to go back to the big group and you don't need to defer to the director. You've got a set of principles and you use them to make decisions and keep moving. And that is like, it bums me out how many times the right people, like the curator or the strategist or the person who's done all the research, and it's like, oh, if we just do it this way, it's slightly harder, but it's culturally better, it meets our fashion, whatever. And the decision actually doesn't get made there. It gets made by someone who doesn't understand it or someone who doesn't have the time to do it. And I think we need to own our decisions, defend them really well, and like own that mission value, that mission grounded prioritization, and let shit go. That is with rubbish at letting shit go. Let it go. Kill it. Turn it off. Do the thing that's good. And I say that all of the time to the point that people kind of get annoyed by it, but actually now the gallery does it. And it's changed the place. The bits that I work on, it's changed the bits that I work on, because people are like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. I love that you, person of power, said that. But here are our principles for this project, and that's going to go in the backlog. We may not get to it. And you see like a 23-year-old saying that to a senior curator, and they're like, but I just said the thing, doesn't work where I said the thing and you do the thing? Isn't that how? I'm pretty sure that's the power dynamic here. And you're like, no, but the principles. So that thing goes in this bucket and not in the bucket of the getting done bucket. I care about this a lot.
I might just quickly add in something that came up, and I think it's pertinent to the politics question that came up in some discussions last year at the Australian New Zealand Digital Humanities Conference, was about the fact that it's a discipline that has to be comfortable with like learning from below as well as kind of dictating, well, maybe never dictating from on high, but that a lot of academic disciplines have had a culture where you become more expert, and then as the expert you pass that expertise back down. But with the digital and with the sort of rapid transformation of culture, you have to be really comfortable with people like an undergraduate 19-year-old coming in and saying, I know all this stuff, and you go, yeah, I don't know it, but let's have a look at it. You know, let's take your principles.
How to use it for good and not evil.
Yeah. And something that we spend a lot of time on with our students is about getting them to think about their relationships with each other and how those relationships inform the projects that they build. And so we force, I guess, strongly encourage and then force the students to create groups where they don't all have the same first language, or they don't all identify as the same gender, or they don't all come from the same cultural background. And we sort of mandate it, and we say, I know it's uncomfortable, but it's sort of, and at the end, it's really uncomfortable for 6 weeks of semester sometimes. And then in the last few weeks, they say, yes, so I took on this identity in the group because I've got this background, or I wanted to upskill in this way. And I really, this person was really amazing at this, so they took on that, or this person speaks 2 languages, so they've translated our things so it works in English and in Chinese or Mandarin. So a lot of what we do is about the people, not just about the, technology. So yeah, that's kind of part of addressing that. Is there any other? Yeah.
That's like wrapping up the board. I mean, I think all of that's true. I think that one of the biggest things that has changed in the last 2 decades is public space. So where I would come back, and that I think it's important for people who started the profession earlier to recognise something that is of value, is this issue of public space. And I feel really strongly about it in the digital, because I think people live their lives in digital spaces that are not public space. And if I think about a Gen Xer growing up with no technology, or when technology started, it was all public space. The internet felt like a public space, that sense of community. So I think there's the mix of needing to listen, and I absolutely believe it, all of the things that have been said. But I think part of what we need to bring to the big P politics of it is understanding that providing public space digitally as well as physically is really important for young people coming through, because a lot of them are living their lives without an understanding of what public space might look like. We had the Kenneth Meyer lecture on Friday night. This is why I need to write names down. That was about to say Nick, Dr. Megan Davis. And she talked about the fact that she went to the art gallery every weekend as a kid. And the reason she went to the art gallery every weekend as a kid is because she lived in Queensland and it was the only access she had to aircon. And anyone who works in the thing knows that a certain portion in the middle of summer of our visitors are there because there's aircon. And that is okay, because this is what public space is about. What's the digital equivalent to aircon that we give people, both to hang out in and also to create their own cultures and worlds? That's what I think. So I agree with all of the points about empowering and bringing people up, but I think we have to meet it with a profession and remember some of the things in our space that young people are less used to or that are new to them as well.
The fragility of corporatised public space is something we don't acknowledge. Dig existed and went away, MySpace existed and went away, Facebook's on its way out. They're all going to come and they're all going to go away. And the thought that all of our peers and then these very famous people are all writing for free for these platforms that are transient is kind of problematic and fascinating. And as a Gen Xer, we used to write the internet, and it was a high agency, high community environment. So now the internet is a fractured set of commercialized walled gardens that are only going to become more fractured and more broken. So yes and. But also the thing that fascinates me is if you go back to collections and digital, at Seccombe we collected the first Google Glass, they sent us one, the first batch, and all the services that make it work, they turn them off. We built this app that everyone got loved and whatever, someone bought one of the bits in the supply chain of technology underneath the thing that we built that was winning all these awards and serving millions of minutes of audio. And they were oh no, we're commercialising that and we're taking it offline because we're going to build this other thing. And so we were fragile too, the museum was fragile. That just disappeared about 2 years and then just turned off one day because they're oh no, someone bought that bit of kit and then turned it off. So there's a fragility to the digital public square that now that we've outsourced it to people who run with a profit motive, and that profit is uncatchable or is state sponsored, is I feel like we've absolutely abdicated that space, both agency and the kind of community bit. And so we talk a lot internally about how do we move from reach to impact and how do we move from access to agency. And we're shit. We're just making it to reach. We're modest on access and we're nowhere near agency. All of that space is uninhabited, I think, by our sector, and it should be. This is where we should be expert, because we've become expert in it in the world.
And it's really interesting too about how institutions actually organise that. No one knows what to do with open software. That it's one of those things where when you do have something that's free for people, I've been working with this program since its inception called Drishti, which visualises volumetric data, and the ANU has never really supported it, even though it's promoted research internationally. We went from 3 people using it to now, I think there's 500,000 people using it, because the big programs that you buy for those visualisations cost thousands of dollars for only one licence, whereas when you have this open software, lots of people can use it and understand the data that they're looking at. But the ANU has never got behind it to go, we need lots of people to work on this, and how can we launch this in. They've never been interested in it. Even though I've even spoken to the Vice Chancellor about it, it's it's open software, what are we going to do? Because it's not going to make us money. It's kind of, it's so appalling. But anyway, that was my bit.
Yeah, don't get me started on it. Go on. I worked in another organisation before I came to the ANU, which I tried to use the open source collections of the Rijksmuseum, and they wouldn't let me because they wanted to pay someone for something. So it was just it's so colonised by the idea that we have to pay rights or pay for when it's made open, it's sometimes hard to use. But I guess I quickly and on practical will say, I know we're running a bit over time, and also that there is now food there, so please grab something on your way out and do that. But I suppose I find the public space discussion really compelling. I did some work, I did some writing on the idea of why we talk about it as a public space, and whether that's a useful metaphor or not, and whether it leads us to become a bit naive about the role that something like Twitter can actually play. But I also sort of, in thinking about this, because I am also a historian, was thinking about the way a lot of the time it's invoking the past. It's like the Greek agora, it's like the Roman Forum. That's what Twitter is. And there's like in 2009 with the Arab Spring, like there was so much discussion about Twitter and Facebook as these new public squares that are going to pull down regimes. But if you look back in history, you learn that these spaces have always been problematic, have always been open to some and not to others. And so there is also that the metaphor could be a useful way of saying it. We need to challenge it. I've just seen that.
Quick question. A quick question to Alison, really. You say you don't know how to collect what is it in terms of digital. Why not? What's wrong with the traditional significance assessment?
I'll just talk loudly. Yeah, no one has an issue. Yeah. I was talking specifically about social media, not digital. Social media is consumed individually by, part of the nature of it is that your consumption, each person's consumption of social media is different to everyone else's. Mm-hmm. So I think when we don't know how to collect it, we don't know how to replicate that in a collecting environment. I think so I wasn't talking about digital as a general concept, because I think lots of digital is well understood and easy to collect. E-books are fine. Audiobooks are great.
My question relates to social media.
Yeah, so I think we've never really, to be honest, it's a lot of rigors. Oh no, I understand. The question is, why are our tools not suitable? Not that, Alice, yes. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. And I think that behind those tools has to be an understanding of the way this is being used. And I don't think we understand how, as a profession, I don't think we've got the depth of understanding or have been able to apply it. That would be my answer. But it's a longer answer than it can deal with. I don't think you need to necessarily reconfigure the tools, but I think something in the way that tool is written implies a simplicity.
I would say, when we need to break, have a look at the new museum. They've done some interesting work in this space and written about it. And I don't think many have. So a new museum in New York, just collecting social media, and just there's some good writing there for later.
There's a culture shift though with significance. So an example which I can't explain fully is that there was a piece of social media that came in front of the museum, and what was proposed by the curator to be collected was the costume that was filmed within that piece of social media. And when it came to me, I was like, well, why are we putting that costume when the social media and the context that it was in was really not about that costume? That was just one way of communicating this particular message. So there's a shift in understanding from a curatorial perspective about what significance is and where it lies and how we apply that or look at it when we're assessing something much more complex than maybe a digital photograph. So there is a culture shift that needs to happen within the sector, which is a skills conversation perhaps as well.
We should follow that.
Yeah.
Really amplify that.
And if you're talking about a photograph on social media, where does the photograph begin and end?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the kind of reborn idea as well, because when it goes on a platform, it's reduced in quality. It's structure kind of changes.
The metadata around the interface, you pull it out of the interface, it's out of the interface. Do you then have to collect Instagram as well as that?
And are we
these
going
are all the questions.
Are we going to collect
that
all of that new AI stuff that everyone's doing? The AI release?
And the things that have been tussling with contemporary collecting for 40 years, one of the issues there in some respects is it's similar challenges.
Set of challenges, yeah. Immediacy as well. I think the contemporary collecting is about collecting now. Hopefully this group can continue to meet next year. more of these conversations. I think we should end it now and make people eat some of their muffins. But thank you to everybody. Thank you to our Chair, Katrina. I just was asked to just tie it up just to say thank you to everybody for coming. And this was an experiment collaborating between AMaGA, ACT and the Humanities Research Centre, and we're not wedded to this model, so please give us ideas if you want to try a different format, different times, different ideas. Share with us what you want to hear from these conversations, and we are going to do more next year, and they may look like this or they may not. So thank you again for coming, and do get in touch.